ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another programme from Education Matters with me, Jim O'Connell. It is Tuesday, January the 22nd. My, how the time flies. 3 weeks into January already, and we're here in the middle of what is going to be the beginning of a budget season here in Manchester for the schools and for the whole city. That budget is under development at this time, and of course we also have the beginnings of rumblings around what's going to happen because at the end of this year there will be elections for local elections for school board members, the mayor, and the Board of Mayor and Aldermen. So there's lots of scuttlebutt out there about who might be running and who might not, but just the early reading of the tea leaves would seem to dictate that, or suggest that there will be a pretty large turnover, and that's separate from what the voters might decide how big the turnover should be, but it looks as though there may be a substantial number of people leave the school board. Whether that's a good thing or not, a lot will depend on who the new occupants of those positions might be. I think it's understandable given the current level of discussion, let's call it, on Manchester School Board. I take no pleasure in commenting negatively about the people who give their time and have run for public office and are our representatives. So that's not where I come from on this. But at the same time, one has to call it like it is. And there's a lot of finger pointing goes on about where faults may lie. But I think there's pretty universal agreement that the school board is, the word that comes to my mind is dysfunctional. I think that's probably maybe too sharp, but certainly it's not a very collegial board. It doesn't instill confidence in those watching it, and this isn't a problem that began just with this board, but it seems that this board is particularly divided. And we saw this in previous boards a number of years back. There are 14 members on the school board, two school board members at large who represent all the wards in the city, and then the 12 ward members, and of course the mayor for a total of 15. And of course, in the case of the school board, the mayor is the chairperson of the school board. She or he is not. Doesn't have the same power as they do on the when there's a meeting of the board, mayor and aldermen, where the mayor actually has a veto. That doesn't pertain to the school board. So we'll see what will happen. I think some long-time people are leaving. Some of these names are in the public domain. The only ones that I have heard announced publicly clearly are Dr. John Avard, who's been I think a 5-term or so at least member of the school board, and also the Katie DeRochers is another one who is leaving the school board. But the word is that quite a few others might bring their time on that board to an end. So we might see a big turnover. I don't know what to feel about that because I worry about it'll all depend on who replaces them, etc. There's little news on people who might run. To jump for a minute to the mayoral race, you may have read on the Union Leader on Dave Solomon's article in the last couple of days about here in the city of Manchester, as far as the mayor's race is concerned, that it is expected that Mayor Craig will run for office again at the end of what will be her first term. her response when asked this week was to the reporter from the Union Leader was that right now she's concentrating on the current budget cycle, and that that was her sole focus. But I think it would be a massive surprise to everybody if Mayor Joyce Craig was not rerunning. So I think we can presume that. It's unknown if there might be any Democratic challenger to her. Nominally, this race, as all races in Manchester are, at least at the local level, are non-partisan or non-party. That's in name only, of course, because oftentimes, people are known to be of one party or another, and things split along those lines quite often. So it looks, from the early tea leaf reading, it looks as though there may not be any challenge on the Democratic side. But according to the article in the Union Leader, there were two people who were at this early stage who were thinking strongly, or considering, or having their names floated at least, and one of those was not a surprise to me, Keith Hirschman, who the alderman from Ward, sorry if I get it wrong, I think it's Ward 12, but Keith Hirschman ran previously in the early 2000s, and according to the article, withdrew from the race for health reasons and didn't complete the race. But it's been, the word has been on the street, so to speak, that he would run for some time. So the other person whose name was mentioned in that article was the former member of the House, Victoria Sullivan, who as I recall, began her political involvement around education issues as a parent of kids in the city, and then served a couple of terms, I think, in the House before being defeated in the last election. So that would mean at least two. And the word is that there are two other candidates for mayor who, on the Republican side, who will run against Victoria Sullivan and Keith Hirschman if, in fact, they choose to run. Now, it shouldn't be any surprise to people who know me to know that I don't mean to make any of these things personal. I like the fact, what I like about Keith Hirschman, I probably differ from him on many policy issues, but what I like about him, I guess, is what you're getting. He is, he's going to always, when I talk to him about schools, etc., it's always going to come back to, issues around we have to control spending, etc. And I don't want to malign him in any way, I think he'd be proud of that stance. So I'd be open to correction, but that's my view of him. And then, again, Victoria Sullivan and I are diametrically opposed on many education issues. I remember meeting with her a number of times in Concord when we were discussing, or when various education bills were being discussed in Concord, and I would make a point of, since she was on the education committee, I would make a point of going to talk to her, and because there was no point in talking to the 4 or 5 other representatives from Manchester who were voting in a way that wouldn't remove funding from Manchester schools, and in particular around the issue of Senate Bill 193, which is now defunct. It was defeated in the last legislative process, and is unlikely to be successful now that Democrats control the House and the Senate. But that bill would have seen a reduction in funding to the City of Manchester for public schools, and this thin end of the wedge, as I see it, the argument for so-called parental choice, whether everybody involved in that movement intentionally it means it this way or not. The fact is that it is a manner to a method to reduce funding for public schools and divert that public funding to other sources. And the bill that was first promulgated as Senate Bill 193, which was much changed over time to make it more amenable to some people, was a particularly anti-public education bill. Let me grab a caller here. Good evening, caller. You're on the air. Who's this?
Hi, this is Ricky. I'm a big fan of the show.
Hey, Ricky.
I'm a Manchester resident homeowner, and when I saw that Superintendent Vargas was stepping down, I just said, "Oh boy, here we go again." Things are getting worse. They're certainly not getting any better. Right. And as I was looking through the Hippo Press today, I noticed there was a lot of interesting-looking charter schools in the area that are popping up. In my opinion, take it what it is worth, the whole system has just got to do a massive overhaul. We've got to work. Everybody has to work together. These smaller unit schools, charter schools, if you would coincide with the public schools. Right now, they don't even seem like they even acknowledge each other's existence. It's ridiculous.
Well, I think
we've got to do something. We've got to do a major overhaul, some sort of change, and work together with the charter schools and just revamp the whole system. I think I'm probably living in a fool's paradise.
Well, I think Rick.
I would like to hear what you have to say about that.
Thank you, Ricky. I appreciate the call. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right. Bye. It's always nice to hear from people, and as a Manchester resident and taxpayer, it's great to know that people are paying attention. Where to begin? So with regard to charter schools, right now there is cooperation between the public schools and public charter schools, and their public charter schools are funded by the they get the state grant that otherwise would have gone to the public schools in Manchester, but their students are bused by the Manchester School Department. Oftentimes kids from charter schools partake in like extracurricular activities. So if you have a kid at a charter school in Manchester who, let's take a high school kid or a middle schooler, if they are at a charter school and let's say they don't have sports programs, and many of them don't, then if your kid ordinarily by geography in the city would have gone to say Central, then the kids who are in the charter school would end up playing on Central teams, and they can play tennis or basketball or football or whatever it may be. Likewise with the music program, many of the charter schools don't have music programs like band and choir, etc. And so there is cooperation between them. But I think I disagree with you, caller, in one way, because going back to the very first cases, the problem is that the public school system has been underfunded and has gone through a process of defunding over a period of time. So when we find ourselves in the city of Manchester with the arguably a population with the highest with high levels of free and reduced lunch, which is an indication of family income, etc. And with we are in the end an urban area, the largest urban area in the state of New Hampshire. And so, and with all its accordant problems and issues and challenges, and of course all its blessings and benefits as well. But we have lots of needs in our school district, and then to find that Manchester has systematically underfunded its schools on a year-in, year-out basis over at least the last 10 years, but probably a lot longer with fits and starts prior to that. But today we find ourselves with a school system a public school system in Manchester, which spends less than everybody else on a per student basis, has got the highest number of students per class across its classes, and people want to point to the results, and we need to do something. And I respect your opinion because none of us have all the answers. I don't believe I have all the answers, but it does irk me when people talk about we need to do something as though we didn't know the answer, where the answer might lie. Well, one of the answers lies in, I like to go back to a time when, for instance, in our middle schools, we eliminated half the teachers, and half the time that was spent on English, on learning English. So by that I mean I'm not talking about English for non-English speakers. I'm talking about English classes, doing typical grammar and writing, etc., and reading. And we eliminated 50% of the time, because we eliminated 50% of the teachers teaching that in our middle schools. We took away half the time that children in 6th, 7th and 8th grade in Manchester had every day, all year long, to spend reading, writing and learning English. And then we'll have people come along and they'll ask questions they want to talk about academic outcomes and why aren't our outcomes improving? Well, when you've reduced 50% of the time that a kid is in front of a teacher, and you would, unless you got a corresponding 50% drop in academic outcomes, then anything above 50% is a positive, I guess. In other words, when you take away half the time and half the resources, you'd imagine that the scores would go in half. Well, the people who don't want to spend a dime on our schools, and the fact we have the cheapest schools in the state of New Hampshire, and by the way, in Manchester, our schools are cheaper than the average school across the whole United States. And if you think about that for a minute, we do live in New Hampshire, which happens to be in New England, and a household income and per capita income in the state of New Hampshire is somewhere around 5th, 6th or 7th in the United States. So we're quite a wealthy state, actually, contrary to what some might state, but the facts are pretty plain, and you can go and study the statistics and get them for yourself. So here we are in the biggest city in one of the wealthier states in the United States, and we spend on average less on our students in Manchester than is spent on the average student across the other 49 states. And we spend the absolute lowest, by far, of all other towns in the state of New Hampshire. So, yes, the system does need to be revamped, and something should be done, because asking teachers and paraprofessionals and teachers' aides and subs, when you're paying, $350 a week to subs, you can't get subs in the schools. And so when a teacher is out, we have kids distributed across other classes. So while they may nominally have reduced the number of kids in classes over the last couple of years since Dr. Vargas has been here. And by the way, Ricky, I agree with you 100%. You implied, I think you might have stated it expressly, that you were a fan of Dr. Vargas. At least that's how I understood your comment to be, and I agree with you fully. I don't think I would have ever gotten everything I'd wanted from Dr. Vargas, but Dr. Vargas was a breath of fresh air, and I liked his ability to, and his willingness to speak out and say, we do need to be competitive. We live in the real world. We've got to deliver value for taxpayers. But we also, the quid pro quo is, we've got to tell taxpayers when kids are not getting the resources they need. And he was clear, telling the school board that, he would go and he would implement whatever policy the school board wished to have, because in the end he's a chief executive officer, a CEO, not a policy driver. So he always made plain to them, you make the policy and I'll drive the policy forward and do whatever you ask. But let's not play Mickey the Dunce here, where you give me instructions to do something and then don't want to take ownership of the fact that you had me do it. What I disliked about earlier superintendents was the fact that they would often, there was this sort of fudge game that went on, which was when asked, well, can you make do with 10% less here, or if we remove this program here, will that be, and the answer would always be, after stuttering and stammering a little bit, it would be looking up at the guy who was paying your check and thinking, I'd prefer to keep my job than lose it. So the answer was always not to stand up for the parents and families and children of Manchester, but just say, yes, Your Honour, we'll make that work. Oh, I think we'll be able to make that work, Your Honour. Well, and then go back up to their office and you know, in a state of semi-panic, wondering about how they were going to squeeze more blood out of this turnip. So we've been squeezing the Manchester School District for a long time. And I've said many times, going back over the years, when I was having conversations with my people who used to call themselves fiscal conservatives before they all became profligate spenders, but the original sort of Republican conservatives that many of my friends were and are, would say to me, as somebody who supports proper public funding, they would say, Jim, we've got to, be responsible, and we've got to find savings wherever we can, and there's waste in the system, and we'll squeeze the waste out. And of course, I believe in being responsible and etc. But it seemed to me that since we were running a pretty lean, mean machine already, I didn't know where they would find the waste. And effectively, that was when our school district wasn't the least well-funded school district in the state, etc. We've gotten ourselves now all the way to the bottom. On an annual basis, we still don't fund our schools in percentage numbers. So, like, for instance, the year before last, I believe it was, the increase in the budget in Manchester was 1.6% or 1.3%. It wasn't 1.6, it was 1.3%, I think it was, and it was 2 point something in Nashua, as an example. So just in a snapshot of just that 1 year alone, we weren't keeping up with comparative towns. So this has gone on and on and on. So my long-winded, I'm sorry for being long-winded, but my response to what you say, Rick, is yes. I mean, there are no holy cows here. Things should be examined and looked at. But the idea that we need to open, and I'm not anti-charter schools per se, by the way, but the idea that we somehow need charter schools and we need to come up with new ideas for new schools because somehow the current model doesn't work, and none of us can work out why that is so, and we have failing schools someplace, and what should we do, and let's scratch our heads and try and work. That's a heap of hogwash. Anybody within the system can tell you what is wrong. When you've got teachers who are again now working with no contract after coming off of a difficult contract negotiation just 2.5 or 3 years ago, after going a number of years without a contract again, when our teachers are the least well compensated teachers of the 5 major urban areas in the state, where we have teachers leaving the state, contrary to what some aldermen have claimed in the past and now don't claim it so much. You just can't keep sweating the asset. We were delivered, 21 schools or whatever it is, in school buildings and facilities, and a school system that was a great school system, the oldest high school in the state, in Central High School, remarkable institutions at West and Memorial, and now the newer MST. And these schools, going back for over 100 years, have produced great people and great citizens, great business people, great public servants, and have been the pride of the city and the pride of the state of New Hampshire. And we've taken all those assets as a current generation, and we've said thank you very much to those who went before us, and said, but we're stopping all of this. We're not spending another dime. So it's been a while since I have mentioned this on my show, but I've talked previously about the fact that, besides, some of our schools have multiple buildings, but we have 21 or 22 schools. But in order to right now we haven't. The last time we built the school was 1997. I think it was. McLaughlin might have been 1997. I think it was, or 1995, somewhere around there. I haven't looked at the figures in a long time because I got tired of talking about it. But let me just turn this off there. But where's the plan to renew these schools, to spend money on updating them? When are we going to build a new school? It took us 150 years to build the 20 something schools that we have, and then 30 years ago now we decided to stop. We were all done. And there is no plan on replacing anything, renewing anything. Now, by the way, there is scuttlebutt going on from the people in the cheap seats, particularly those from out of town, sort of professional anti-public school people. If you go on Facebook any day, and these people are pushing ideas about closing some of Manchester schools and consolidating them, and et cetera, et cetera. And all of this is a multi-year project for these people because they've been anti-public schools from the start. And every now and again, when you go on Facebook or other social media and you look at some of the truth comes out when you look at the people who jump on and support these ideas because they're less clever at covering their footprints. And like I read today, for somebody who was promoting the elimination of 2 of the 3 high schools in Manchester and rolling them all into one. And of course, underneath it, there are comments from people who say that our schools are we need to eliminate them because they're godless and they're teaching socialism and they are indoctrinating our children and all this tinfoil hat hogwash. But sadly, the fact of the matter is that we now have people in public office and people organizing on a bought and paid for sometimes by outside agencies who are advocating to eliminate public schools, and some to eliminate them and some to reduce them. And so we have seen nationally a sort of resegregation happening. So. We know already, in the state of New Hampshire, that if you go to that the amount of money that is spent by the state of New Hampshire on education is the lowest of any state. So we don't we push all the costs for our schools onto local taxpayers, which has the convenient benefit for the wealthiest of being able to, buy a house in a town with more expensive properties in it, and then their schools are very well funded. And for instance, there are towns in the state of New Hampshire who spend almost 3 times per student, what the city of Manchester spends, and there are many, many towns who spend twice what the city of Manchester spends on students. If you can just think about that for a minute. And oftentimes, of course, the people going to those towns and going to those schools are the people with the least needs to begin with. They don't have the degree of free and reduced lunch students that we have. They don't have the number of kids with challenges that we have. And yet the system allows these people to extricate themselves from being part of what should be a robust public school system. So in a roundabout way, Rick, I think you're right when you talk about the system needs to be revamped, but not revamped because it's broken and we don't know what's wrong with it. We do know what's wrong with it. You can't be successful when you've been stripping money out of the system for 20 years, 10 years for sure, but somewhat longer than that. And when you keep electing people to public office, and we have people in public office in Manchester today who have been up in Concord voting to reduce funding for Manchester schools. the issue which we've talked often about, and I don't want to go through it all here again, but the state made a decision 4 or 5 years ago to eliminate its contribution to the state teachers' pension system, and just hand it down back to the city of Manchester and all the other towns. Now, as those of you who've watched this show know, that the city of Manchester wasn't at the table, didn't have a seat when the agreement was reached to fund that the state would fund teacher pensions in the state of New Hampshire many years ago. We weren't party to that conversation. But the state, in its wisdom, 4 or 5 years ago, so that people could claim that, we held the line on taxes, just passed these costs back down to the city. That cost alone is $4 million a year in the city of Manchester. And at roughly $50,000, which in itself is a shameful number, right? The loaded cost for a new teacher in Manchester, $50,000. That's all costs, including their salary of $35,000, plus their any benefits and all the rest of it. So, that's 20 teachers per million. So that $4 million a year that the state of New Hampshire passed down to us would give us 80 teachers. I don't know what schools your children are. If you're watching this program, I don't know what schools your children are in, but with 21 schools and 80 teachers, there'd be 4 new teachers in all the schools. That'd be 1 extra teacher per grade in most schools. Think about what that might do to the numbers. That's just one action by the state of New Hampshire in the last 5 years. And then if you take the stabilization grants, which are being reduced on an annual basis in a drip, death by 1,000 cuts, Chinese torture type action, is being eliminated to be completed by the year 2040, when stabilization grants will have been eliminated by the state. So every year a little more gets passed down to the taxpayers of Manchester. So that's fine if you're sitting up in Concord and you want to be re-elected by saying, I won't take the tough decisions, and I won't go on television and say to the people of the state of New Hampshire, we're not funding our education adequately. So instead of that, I'll find any method I can to pass it out to people. So you pass it down to local taxpayers. And then local taxpayers, of course, property tax payers are saying, what the heck, I'm being taxed here, like I'm carrying all this weight. Why am I doing that? And so it's fine. And the reason why it doesn't matter is because the people who it hurts most are the people with the least economic and therefore political clout in the state. So as an example, just yesterday or the day before, but this week anyway, up in the town of Berlin, we have they used to have 3 elementary schools in the city of Berlin. And the last of the 3 elementary schools closed, or it was announced this week that it's closing. And they're going to revamp the high school, which was never designed for little children with little legs on little seats, with little bathrooms and etc. But they're going to revamp and try and, without any money, and try and put them into the high school. So in the state of New Hampshire, we're closing the last elementary school in Berlin. And then you'll again have these, and I hate to be so whatever, but I use the word again, these sanctimonious, self-righteous, self-congratulatory politicians, starting with Governor Sununu and everybody on down from him, and they'll talk about commitments to the North Country and what we can do to demonstrate that we support we value all the people of our state. That it's not just the towns of Newcastle and Rye and a few places around Portsmouth and a couple of spots up around some other corners of the state, but actually we are here to support all the people. Well, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, ladies and gentlemen. So going up to Berlin and offering some, token program with $20,000 to promote some, people visiting to ski or whatever, while allowing the very infrastructure that keeps people in the North Country to fall apart. And then come all the way down to Manchester, and you had an alderman who, in a long line of such aldermen, turn around 2 or 3 years ago, the first person that I ever heard in Manchester seriously propose the closure of what is the oldest and longest established public high school in the state of New Hampshire, the Central High School, a newly elected alderman, who's very so-called fiscal conservative, comes out and writes an op-ed in the Union Leader, and says that we should look at closing Central High School. But what does he do as soon as his kids are old enough to go to school? He scarpers off midway through his term, I think his first term too, but he planted the seed, started a conversation, and then said, I'm out of here. I'm going to go take my kids someplace else. And there's been a long line of those, by the way. Anybody who's paying attention, just go back and look at the list of people who have served on the Manchester School Board over the last 20 years, who've been the loudest voices for being, anti-teacher, anti-school, change the system. We need to open up other, private schools. We need to do something because, need to do something except actually spend any money on our schools or pay for new books or buy them computers or fix the leaking roof or fix the potholes in the parking lot or buy new band uniforms or buy instruments for the band or fix the playing fields. We won't vote for any of that. And then as soon as they have children, and I just don't want to be personal about it, but all of you, anybody who's been around in Manchester long enough knows that face after face after face has appeared on that school board, come in, done the dirty deed, and then as soon as their kids are old enough to hit public schools, they're off out to some town like Bedford or further afield because they're going to seek richer pastures there. We have this issue with that the conversation, which is only beginning, about closing our high schools in Manchester, which was begun by this gentleman who came, did his, threw his grenade over the wall and then left, but still likes to offer opinions to the people in Manchester, though he doesn't live here anymore. We have an effort being led, or at least being proposed and pushed by a gentleman who was a former school board member in the town of Hooksett, who is constantly on social media talking about how Manchester needs to be more competitive and therefore it should start the process of amalgamating schools, etc. So this goes on and on and on. And back before the surrounding towns left, there were people, some of them on the current school board in Manchester, who for years, you couldn't have a conversation in Manchester through the 1990s until 2012 or 14. You couldn't have a conversation about what to do about the situation about improving schools in Manchester and how we needed to do something about slowly climbing, if that's not the wrong word, falling then towards the bottom of the pile in terms of per capita spending and the percentage of our tax dollars going to schools and all those things that was being reduced every year, because the conversation was always clouded by the fact that we had, first of all, of course, Bedford was here before it built its high school, but we also had Hooksett and Candia and Auburn. And every time you get into a conversation, you'd have members of the school board, some of whom, as I said, are still there, who would claim that the reason why the Manchester schools were we were basically subventing the surrounding towns, and the problem was that we were paying for the education for people from out of town, and if we could just get rid of them, then the problem would all be fixed and we'd have glory days. Now, once again, it's like trickle-down economics. It doesn't work. You take out a piece of paper and you write down start doing some math, get out a calculator, use a little logic or some basic economic principles, just very simple ones, Economics 101, and you can clearly demonstrate that this stuff doesn't work, but they'll insist that it does. And so what did we do? Well, we pushed the surrounding towns out, and when we did, we put the gun to their head, and in our arrogance, we told them that they had the greatest deal in the world here in Manchester, and that, if they didn't like it, we weren't going to do anything about it. We had, the time when we were talking about 42 kids in a classroom in Manchester, not in every classroom, but that was when it reached its crescendo. And our answer to them was, our way or the highway, and if you don't like it, then see what you can do somewhere else. And guess what they did? They went someplace else. So today we have the Hooksett High School. Hooksett now has 2 children left going to where there used to be hundreds and hundreds of Hooksett kids going to Central High School and also to West, that starting this year, there are 2 kids from Hooksett going to be at Central High School in the freshman year and 0 at West High School. And people in Hooksett are putting their kids on buses way earlier in the morning than they otherwise would have, and it is galling to see buses transporting students from Hooksett through the city of Manchester down to Derry, to Pinkerton, so that they transport their kids to there, where they're paying less than they would have paid in the city of Manchester, and their students have a greater number of choices. So, but you couldn't tell people that for years because they knew the answers already. Why I like Dr. Vargas and supported Dr. Vargas to the extent I was is because he called some of this stuff out, and he wouldn't have it that having middle schools with no foreign languages, having no remedial English learner classes, having eliminated classes for kids to do academic recovery, having eliminated classes and programs all across the district. At least Dr. Vargas was willing to say publicly in front of a board when asked that this is educationally unsound and we need to do something about it. And he did do a comparative analysis, not to any great depth that I know of, but he went out and he would talk about what choices parents had. And it wasn't about, why don't a half dozen of us who have the wherewithal to do it, we want our kids segregated and kept separate from everybody else, go and open some school in some corner building in Manchester and call it, the great and best school of, the Jim O'Connell. So rather than doing that, he was talking about real school choice, about people vote with their feet, and if you don't, if there's a better education to be had, with lower class sizes and more teachers per student and more class offerings in surrounding towns, then people will go there. He was willing to say that, which I despair for who we might get next and whether they might actually say it or not. I also have to say that in the middle of all of that, there's a dirty little secret in the city of Manchester around special education, and it shouldn't be a secret at all for those with their eyes open, but. We have our spending on special education has increased over recent years. Now, there may be many reasons for that, and one of the reasons is because we have a more needy population. You can't have the level of and I don't want to lay it on this door because it's more than this, but just as an example, the effect of the opiate crisis, the effect that's having on families, on the parents of families, and the effect it's having on very young children, and young children being traumatized because of their experience at the hands of families that are not families at all, really. They're just born into situations that look nothing like families anymore. This past weekend, we had 37 families. There were 37 homeless families in the city of Manchester. And that doesn't include families that are living, these are families living in cars and in other temporary places. That doesn't include people who are homeless. There's a much bigger homeless problem generally. But as far as families are concerned, that doesn't include families who've moved in with a sister or a mum and dad or in-laws or something. These are actual homeless families, and there's room for 12 at the shelter in Manchester, and the Way Home or whatever it is, and they've got a waiting list. So these things have a real effect, and they affect our education. While this has been going on, we've been not, at very minimum, not keeping up. We've actually been reducing, but we, in real terms, we haven't been keeping up with the actual costs. But the dirty little secret part was that for some years, perhaps many years in Manchester, we were not giving special education students the resources that they needed. And the only people who could actually get the programs that they were mandated to have were people who could afford to go and seek injunctive relief or go to an attorney or go to court and demand it. And there are cases in Manchester that everybody knows about, I mean everybody in the system knows about, where parents, where there are parents with the wherewithal to do it, who have gone and sought legal remedies to force the city of Manchester to actually do for their kids what they're required to do by law. And even in those cases, they sometimes can't get the city to respond adequately. Now, I want to share with you, and I try not to make this. I don't want to. None of this. I don't get any jollies from attacking people, like attacking the school board or anybody else. We can have differences of opinion. So I'm always caught on the horns of this dilemma. My ultimate one is around the topic of believing that the wonderful things that happen in our schools every day, the great work the teachers are doing, the wonderful children we have, their resiliency, the wonderful academic results that come out of our school. There's so many good things that happen in our schools every day. The benefit that my kids have had from public education in Manchester. So knowing all of that, and at the same time coming on here on a weekly basis and explaining to people in Manchester, or if maybe not explaining, maybe you all know already, and what I'm doing is just highlighting it for you, because sometimes it's uncomfortable stuff and people don't want to talk about it because they prefer to, as we say back in Ireland, whistle past the graveyard. But so these kids in special education have not been getting the services that they need. We've had growing needs, and the services are not being supplied. So what I wanted to share with you from the social media, from conversations that went on today, is a number of school board members were discussing these issues on social media yesterday and today, and there's been sometimes the city of Manchester, because it doesn't have the programs needed to deal with children who've got major emotional or psychological issues, and they may have cognitive issues or speech and pathology issues, or all kinds of issues, everything from the most severe cases of physical and intellectual disability through to simple, maybe not simple, they're not simple for the individual kids, but challenges around preparedness for school, etc., and a need for remedial teaching and that stuff. And the programs are just not very robust, and when the kids that need it the most, it can be quite expensive to do it. And so we often end up, because we don't have the programs in-house, we end up having to send kids out of city and sometimes out of state. And these things can cost as much as $400,000. Now, that's a huge amount of money, but and it's an extraordinarily high amount for unique sets of circumstances. But in the end, when we made the decision many years ago to bring kids and try to mainstream them as much as possible, and we closed down, major facilities in Concord and elsewhere that were like county hospitals and homes for children here, and there are still a lot of them, by the way, but the ones that we would recognize as that. There are facilities for kids who are severely physically and intellectually incapacitated, and they need 24 hours a day, 7 days a week care, and oftentimes this stuff falls to the school district, and people don't understand that. I keep on hearing people talking about how the parents need to be involved and all that. Well, if you've got a kid who's anyway, I don't want to get to the point about the social media in the last couple of days. So 2 or 3 school board members are on talking about this issue, and someone says, well, the city of Manchester should supply these programs. We're the biggest city in the state. We should have programs for these severely needy children, and then what we should do is, instead of we joining the other towns in the state here when sending kids down to Massachusetts and up to Maine, I know a kid who's going to Maine, or at least was going to Maine, just in the last few months, and he travels to just in Kittery, to a facility in Kittery every day, and travels back. And I was with a kid just today who travels to Massachusetts every day. These are severely, maybe that's too strong a word, these are very, kids with very large challenges. But the point is, why wouldn't Manchester, being the biggest city, finance a program? And we have lots of talented people, and create a facility, use one of our current buildings, or part of our buildings, or have a facility where we could do this. But the point is that it would be a revenue source for the taxpayers and the people of Manchester. That all the other towns in the surrounding area, instead of paying individual bus drivers and taxi drivers or school bus drivers to bring these kids to various special schools, that they could be here in Manchester, and we would get the benefit from that. And the answer, not the only answer, but a series of comments from 2 or 3 Manchester school board members was that if you build it, then we're just going to attract more people. So now just think about this for a minute. What they were saying was that if Manchester actually had the right services for special needs children, and if we had a robust special needs program rather than one that was being held together with scotch tape, that what would happen is that we'd attract families into the city with highly needed children with special education needs, and that would be a big problem for us. And one of the people who often comments on these threads and has lots of opinions, and actually, I hate to be derogatory, but knows very little and demonstrates his lack of knowledge all the time, but is not wise enough to understand how little he knows. But I offers opinions about, look at Safe Station. We put in place Safe Station, and his comment is, well, don't tell me there's not a connection between putting Safe Station in place for drug addicts and the fact that we have a homeless problem in the city of Manchester. Well, I don't know if any empirical evidence exists for that. It may be that it suits his political ideology, and maybe it salves his conscience that he has ideas and thoughts that are anti. In the end, not anti is too strong a word, but that are he doesn't see. Drug addicts and that problem as a public health problem, but as something that we need to take criminal action against or whatever else. But in this case, as far as so his argument and as part of a conversation with school board members was, look, if we put services in place, then we're going to attract people. They're going to be here. Fair enough. Let's leave that stand on its own legs with regard to the drug problem. But I have to tell you that to hear a number, there's only 15 members on the school board, including the mayor, and to hear more than one of them, 2 or 3, which represents, do the math, 25% or so of the board, or a little less, and we don't know how the others feel, but their argument was, if we actually were to improve our special needs resources in the city and actually have programs in place so that special needs programs were actually adequate, that we would have the effect of attracting people with special needs children into the city, and that would be a problem for us because it would be too expensive. Just think about that for a minute. This is the same committee, ladies and gentlemen, when you think about this warped thinking. So now you have to say to yourself, is the fact that we have subpar special education programs? Is it by accident or is it by design? Is it through apathy or is it through antipathy? One is to passively sort of ignore and choose not to see. The second is to actively take action to ensure that those programs are inadequate. The second alternative is a horrible idea, if true. And I don't think actually some of these people aren't exactly intellectual heavyweights, so they don't often think of the logic of their stance and how it gets you into sort of morally dubious and logically challenged positions. But it was appalling to me to, and I'm not naming these people because I don't think they're particularly bad people. I just think they're just wrapped up in this idea about our we have to hold the line on our schools, and if we don't keep the lid on spending and spend less each year in real terms, then we're going to somehow bankrupt ourselves. And the truth of the matter is that they and their pals are passing more and more costs down to the local taxpayers all the time and creating the emergency. Not to get off into national politics, but we have a national shutdown that was initiated by President Trump, caused by President. No matter what people want, you can shout and people can roar about it and use all kind of twisted logic about it. But the bottom line is the only reason that we have a shutdown is because an artificial, made-up crisis, exasperated by presidential action anyway, is there because, and the president himself says he owns it and he's proud of it and he'll take ownership for it. But of course, because he lies about everything, he won't take ownership of that either. And then we come to the school district, and so the very people who are causing the problem and have caused the problem want to talk about how we need to do something about the system because the system's not right and we need to just dismantle it and recreate it. They'll only recreate it if they get a guarantee that it's not going to cost them a dime. So they'd be very happy that the poor people and the least empowered and the impoverished and the challenged and the people with special needs and the neediest would, once they're out of sight, once they're not sort of on the main street where they can be seen, that's fine, because they'd be very happy to have their kids in, nice private schools, private charter schools, any place where they can put it where they're not part of the mainstream and pretend, and then out of sight, out of mind, it's all okay. So you can close down elementary schools up in Berlin, and if you live in, I don't know, Newcastle or Rye, you don't have to worry about the fact that the students of Manchester have far less money spent on them every day in every week in every classroom than your kids do in your beautiful classrooms, because it's out of sight, out of mind. And you may have to come down to Manchester once in a while to get your butt kicked on the football field or on the basketball court, but then you can snigger into your fingers about, well, those are the inner city kids, and that's what they do, and our gentle Johnnies and Marys are too genteel for that, so we'll play more genteelly in our beautifully manicured fields. But the bottom line is, at the state level in particular, and then with their sycophants and hirelings here in Manchester doing the dirty work for them, we in the state of New Hampshire have a public education system that we've been defunding and underfunding for year after year after year. As I've said many times, besides the facts about what we have here locally, we have the highest in-state tuition of any university system in all 50 states. There's no place you can go where you pay more to go to college than you do in the state of New Hampshire, directly as a result of budget cuts in Concord over the last 5 or 6 years. And then, as a result of that, we have our students, young people, young men and women coming out of school, going out trying to buy houses, rent apartments, starting off in jobs, going to buy their first car, getting engaged, becoming married. We have the highest level of student debt of any state in the United States. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave you with that depressing talk. I hope to see you again next week, and perhaps we'll be on jollier ground. All the best, and good night from Jim O'Connell.